Right now, something fundamental is cracking inside Iran. Hundreds are dead, thousands arrested. Cities are burning with anger while the country goes dark under an internet blackout. And outside Iran's borders, the most powerful country in the world is watching and debating whether to step in. This is not just another protest cycle. This is what happens when an economic collapse collides with an authoritarian system that no longer absorbs pressure but releases it violently. When a currency hits record lows, shopkeepers march. When sanctions squeeze harder, streets fill faster. And when the state responds with force, the question stops being whether the system is stable and becomes how much longer it can hold. The United States says it stands ready to help. Iran says any intervention will be met with fire. If you want to understand why this moment matters, not just for Iran, but for global stability, stay with me. Because before we talk about intervention, we need to understand the problem itself. And that story begins with what these protests really represent. What we're witnessing in Iran is not chaos without structure. It is pressure behaving exactly as systems theory predicts. These demonstrations are not driven by a single law, a single arrest, or a single speech. They are the visible release of accumulated economic pain and political exclusion. An economy under sanctions, contracts, a currency collapses to record lows. Daily life becomes more expensive, more fragile, more humiliating. And when institutions offer no meaningful channel for dissent, the street becomes the system's only outlet. The Iranian leadership frames this unrest as foreign-backed rioting. The protesters frame it as survival. Both sides are speaking past each other because they are operating from incompatible realities. At the same time, the United States enters the picture not as a neutral observer, but as a declared moral actor. Words of support, hints of intervention, public signals sent into an already volatile environment. This is the central tension, a domestic crisis unfolding inside a sovereign state, while global power hovers just outside its borders. To understand why this moment feels different, we need to step back and look at how Iran arrived here in the first place. Iran did not wake up one morning and stumble into this moment. What you're seeing now is the end of a long economic and political cycle tightening year after year. Sanctions targeted Iran's oil sector, revenue shrank, foreign currency dried up, and the rial fell until it hit record lows. That collapse was not abstract. It translated into prices that no longer made sense to ordinary people. Savings evaporated, margins disappeared. Shopkeepers, often the backbone of urban stability, walked into the streets of Tehran because the math of survival had broken. At the same time, power remained centralized and rigid. No safety valves, no adaptive release of pressure. When institutions cannot bend, stress migrates outward into public space. This is how economic crisis becomes political unrest. Not overnight, but through repetition, through erosion, through the slow realization that tomorrow will not be better than today. When demonstrations spread from Tehran to Mashhad and beyond, they followed the logic of systems under strain. And once the streets fill, the state faces a choice. That choice, how to respond, turns pressure into tragedy. Then the first rupture arrives. Not in theory, not in speeches, but in bodies. Human rights groups report hundreds killed, more than 500 lives lost, thousands arrested, women, children, numbers that are hard to verify because the country has gone dark under an internet blackout. This is the moment a protest stops being a warning and becomes a crisis. The state calls them rioters, foreign-backed mercenaries, a threat to national security. The protesters see something else. A government that answers economic desperation with force. A system that no longer distinguishes between dissent and danger. This is how legitimacy erodes, not when people protest, but when the response convinces millions that peaceful pressure is futile. And it's here that the outside world leans forward. The President of the United States says, America stands ready to help. Hints at intervention, signals moral alignment with the protesters. If you're trying to understand global politics today, pay attention to this moment, because words alone can shift trajectories. And once violence reaches this scale, the crisis stops being internal. It becomes strategic, because beneath the blood and slogans, a deeper mechanism is now in motion. What's unfolding now is not simply repression versus resistance. It is a structural lock-in. Authoritarian systems survive by controlling escalation. They allow just enough pressure to release anger, but never enough to threaten the core. Iran's problem is that its economic crisis has removed that margin. When the currency collapses, loyalty becomes expensive. When sanctions strain the state, compromise looks like weakness. And when protests spread across cities, the leadership faces a binary choice: concede or crush. The internet blackout is not incidental. It is a mechanism: cut communication, fragment coordination, isolate the narrative. At the same time, rhetoric hardens. Protesters become terrorists. External powers become conspirators. Every internal failure is reframed as foreign sabotage. This is how systems protect themselves, by externalizing blame. But there's a cost. Once a government defines dissent as treason, it loses flexibility. Every concession risks collapse. Every crackdown deepens resentment. This is the trap Iran is now in. And traps don't stay static. They tighten until something gives. And when it does, the consequences rarely remain contained. The second rupture is forming, and this one doesn't stay inside Iran. It emerges the moment foreign power enters a domestic crisis. The United States signals readiness to intervene to protect protesters. Iran responds by drawing a red line clearly, publicly, unmistakably. Any intervention, Tehran says, will make American bases, ships, and regional allies legitimate targets, Israel included. This is escalation logic at work. What began as economic protest now carries the architecture of regional conflict. Not because either side seeks war, but because signaling replaces dialogue. Each statement narrows options. Each warning hardens posture. And miscalculation becomes more likely than restraint. Inside Iran, leadership closes ranks. Unity is invoked. Distinctions are drawn between protesters and terrorists. The system prepares for siege. Outside, Iran policymakers face a dilemma with no clean exit. Do nothing, and the deaths continue. Do something, and the conflict expands. This is the second crisis, when moral outrage collides with strategic reality. And when great powers step closer, ordinary people bear the weight. Because the real impact of this standoff isn't measured in statements. It's measured in lives. And that brings us to you. If you're watching this from the outside, it's easy to think in abstractions. Sanctions, sovereignty, intervention, strategy. But inside Iran, this crisis feels very different. It feels like fear when the internet goes dark, like uncertainty when streets fill with soldiers instead of customers, like helplessness when protesting for survival is labeled terrorism. If you're a shopkeeper, your livelihood collapsed before your courage did. If you're a parent, every arrest feels like a coin toss with fate. If you're young, you're caught between silence and risk, and both carry consequences. This is what systemic failure looks like at the human level. Not ideology, but exhaustion. Not geopolitics, but daily survival. And when outside powers speak of help, hope rises, but so does danger. Because intervention doesn't arrive gently. It arrives with reactions, reprisals, and unintended costs. If this story matters to you, if you believe political analysis should start with people, not power, this is the moment to stay engaged, to keep watching, to keep questioning. Because what happens next won't just shape Iran's future. It will redefine the limits of protest in a connected world. And the consequences won't stop at Iran's borders. Iran's crisis is now interacting with the global system, and systems transmit shock. When the United States signals possible intervention, it doesn't speak only to Tehran. It speaks to every regional actor watching closely. Allies calculate risk. Adversaries test resolve. Iran responds by widening the frame. American bases, ships in the region, Israel. The message is simple. Escalation will not be contained. This is how local unrest becomes geopolitical leverage. Sanctions already strain the economy. Now, uncertainty strains the region. Markets react to instability. Security planners prepare for contingencies that nobody publicly wants but must privately assume. And inside Iran, external pressure reinforces internal narratives. The leadership points outward. Foreign threats justify internal crackdowns. Nationalism becomes a shield against dissent. This feedback loop is dangerous because each side believes it is acting defensively, while the system as a whole drifts toward confrontation. History shows us this pattern repeatedly. Domestic legitimacy crises invite foreign involvement. Foreign involvement hardens domestic repression. And once that cycle begins, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult, which leaves us with the hardest question of all. What happens next? There are three paths forward from here, and none of them are simple. The first is restraint. Protests continue. The state relies on force, but avoids wider war. The United States limits itself to words and signals. The system absorbs pain without collapsing. This is the least dramatic outcome and the most fragile, because it assumes exhaustion will arrive before transformation. The second path is partial change. Internal pressure forces limited adjustments. Calls for unity translate into selective concessions. Not reform, but relief. Enough to slow the streets. Enough to buy time, but not enough to resolve the underlying economic and political strain. And then there is the third path, the one systems fall into, not choose. Escalation, a misread signal, an intervention framed as protection, a retaliation framed as defense. Domestic crisis merges with regional conflict. This is how internal legitimacy crises become international shocks. None of these futures is guaranteed, but all are now plausible. Because when pressure, power, and pride collide, history rarely rewards optimism. And that brings us to the final question. What does this moment actually teach us? This moment in Iran is not just about protests or presidents or power. It's about what happens when a system stops listening and the world starts watching. Economic collapse pushed people into the streets. Force pushed them into silence. And global attention turned a domestic crisis into a strategic crossroads. The United States says it stands ready to help. Iran says any intervention will be met with retaliation. Between those two positions live millions of ordinary people, navigating fear, hope, and uncertainty with no control over the forces shaping their lives. This is the uncomfortable truth of modern politics. Moral clarity does not guarantee good outcomes. And restraint, when delayed too long, can look indistinguishable from indifference. If there's one insight to carry forward, it's this. Systems don't collapse because people protest. They collapse when they lose the ability to adapt. If you want to understand where the world is heading, don't just watch leaders. Watch pressure. Watch how states respond when legitimacy is questioned and power is challenged. If this analysis helped you see the pattern beneath the headlines, stay with me. Share this conversation. And keep asking the harder questions, because the next crisis will not announce itself in advance.